Some of us ignorantly from other places have been taught to look at the South with disdain and despair. We call people Bamas, as if Alabama is like they soft in Alabama. Come on, man. This is where some of our hardest come from. The hardest of the hardest of hard shit overcoming in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Come on, man. You from New York and Detroit and these places where it's relatively safe, and we gotta cut that out. We Black Americans, we all from the same seed. That seed starts in the South. The name of this particular talk is Black Americans are all Southerners. And again, I'm talking about Black Americans, of course, from the Southern United States, from the various states across the South, of course them, but also Black Americans who are from the East Coast, whether it be from Washington, D.C. all the way up, or Virginia all the way up, because Virginia is sort of the gateway to the South. Similarly, the Black Americans who find themselves in places like Detroit, Chicago, other areas within the Midwest, whether it's Minnesota or Wisconsin or what have you. These people are also from the South. They're also Southerners, as well as the West Coast. Places like Los Angeles, the surrounding areas around Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area and the surrounding areas around there. The Black Americans who are from these places, they are also from the South. They are all Southerners. They are all part of the tradition and the historical phenomenon known as the Great Migration. Now, what was the Great Migration? Well, I'm glad you asked. So the Great Migration is a point in history between 1910, roughly, and 1970, wherein Black Americans in the southern states migrated from these southern states due to the restrictive, oppressive, Jim Crow, apartheid-style legal system that hampered their mobility. Say, for example, if they had a degree in engineering or medicine or biology or mathematics or whatever it was, whatever sort of degree that they had attained from the historically Black colleges and universities that they had to attend because of the Jim Crow laws. Once they graduated with those degrees, they were not hired in their fields in the South because of and due to the Jim Crow laws. But what was happening in other parts of the country was the United States was in dire need of labor in other parts of the country, particularly because of the Industrial Revolution that was going on, right? And so the manufacturing boom that the United States had become a part of, offered opportunities and job opportunities for Black folks to come out of the South and land jobs working in the factories and support and other supports and networks and opportunities related to the economy that the factories and the manufacturing jobs were producing. So this has a lot to do with for lack of a better term, the blackening of cities like New York City, the blackening of places like Chicago and Detroit by Southerners, Black American Southerners from the South to these different places. I have friends that I've talked to about this, and they're my age, and they didn't know where their ancestors came from in the South. Like I know, for example, my maternal family, they came from North Carolina and they moved northeast. They moved to places like Connecticut, New York City, Brooklyn, New Jersey, Buffalo, New York, right? I know this because my family, when I was young, they made it their business, for as many of us, who were born up north to go back and visit our relatives in the South, right? And so we, at a young age, we knew our family in the South. We went back South regularly during the summers. But I would never hear the stories about what they endured. I didn't realize that they were sharecroppers. Like my mom grew up on a farm working as a sharecropper until she was 9 years old, along with her 14 other siblings. So I didn't know this until I was an adult, until I started doing research, until I started asking questions. And even when I started to ask questions, there were members, elders in my family who weren't comfortable with these kinds of questions. They weren't comfortable having these kinds of conversations. Well, why did some Black folks, some Black Americans have this experience, and why some of us didn't? One of the reasons, I think, is because Black Americans have endured a significant amount of trauma, especially in their lives growing up in the Jim Crow South. You know, you got to understand the restrictive laws. There was a lynching epidemic that happened, that was going on for 50 or 60 years, post-enslavement, right up through the 1960s, where, Black men, women, and children were being lynched for damn near nothing. You had mass rapes by white men of Black women and girls. And in some cases, these rapes led to, babies and children that Black women would have to bear from white men and have to be silent about it. You have all of these experiences, and you have, situations where, some Black men and even women, attacked these white people, and it led to murders, and and then having Black people have to flee the South and go different places, change their names and all of this kind of stuff. So there's so much of this history that's not talked about. So for many of us, the reason why some of us don't know this part of us, when I say all Black Americans are Southern, is it has to do with this. It has to do with the undiagnosed, untreated trauma of the things that they experienced in the South. So when they got to places like Chicago or New York City or LA or Oakland, they didn't want to talk about what their life was like. They just wanted to start all over. So why is this important? Why and what is the rationale? Why did Black American families, Southern families, why did they take the routes that they took? Why did they choose the cities and states that they ended up in? Well, a lot of it had to do with the sophistication of the railroads and the sophistication of the highways at that time. Remember, this is a period between 1910 and 1970, right? So if you look at, for example, on the East Coast, you look at Interstate 95, the Eastern Seaboard. It's a straight shot, coming from Georgia, coming from Virginia, coming from North South Carolina. It's a straight shot, straight up 95. Right? So it makes a lot of sense for folks from these southern states to just go straight up north, as opposed to taking the trip across the countries. And so you have generations of us who are born in these places in New York City, and I'm from New York, I'm from Chicago, I'm from Detroit, I'm from this, that, and the third. Nah, you're people from Mississippi, you're people from Alabama. You were raised by Southerners with Southern values. You could take a Black American from the Midwest, you could take one from the West Coast, you could take one from the East Coast, you take one from the South, and put them on the continent of Africa. And I know this for a fact because me and my friends from these different places found ourselves on the continent of Africa having this very conversation. Our lingo is different, our forms of communication and style might be different, but we're bound by something that's very specific and very understood amongst us. Right? There are certain nuances that we can have, right, in conversation, and that we're going to all know. We can talk in shorthand and know exactly what we're talking about. When I see a Black American on another continent, I know exactly that that's a Black American. I know exactly a Black American from somebody that's from another part of the world. That's because we're connected in that way. We're family in that way. And not to mention the fact that during enslavement, many of our families were ripped apart and sold off to other plantations. So you could have a family in North Carolina, for example, who, some of the children were ripped apart and sold off, and one of the parents was sold off one was sent to Louisiana, another one was sent to Arkansas. So how that manifests over time is 150, 200 years later, with the Great Migration, you have these family members who don't know each other because they were ripped apart. But now you have some in Arkansas, right? And you have some in North Carolina. So the Great Migration trajectory is different from Arkansas to North Carolina. So you got this group of people in New York City and this group of people in LA who don't know each other, but they might be related. And then they might cross paths and then they find a kinship and a bond. There's so much of that amongst us. If we look at some of the most important figures within Black America, whether it be the civil rights leaders and organizations, they all started in the South. Say, for example, civil rights, black power leaders in, say, Oakland, right? The San Francisco Bay Area, and the impact of, say, the Black Panther Party, for example. All the frontline organizers and soldiers and architects of the Black Panther Party are all Southerners who migrated themselves from the South to San Francisco Bay. For example, Huey P. Newton was from Louisiana. Angela Davis and David Hilliard were both from Alabama. Bobby Seale and Kathleen Cleaver were both from Texas. Eldridge Cleaver and Bobby Hutton were both from Arkansas. So these are some of the most important Black Panther Party leaders. And they were a big part of what we know and admire about Oakland and the Bay Area, right? These were Southerners. For example, like let's look at two of the biggest artists, right? Prince, Michael Jackson. How do they show up in this? Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, Michael Jackson, the Jackson 5, Joe Jackson is from Arkansas. The mom is from Alabama. They are, if I'm not mistaken, I believe they're both musicians, and they migrated to Chicago from Alabama and from Arkansas to Chicago, where they met. And then they ended up in Gary, Indiana, and the rest is history. From that, Michael Jackson, this transcendent person, but let's not forget, he's a Black American, and he's part of the legacy and the lineage of the Great Migration. Same with Prince. Both of his parents are from Louisiana. Perhaps his mom is Creole, and they both left Louisiana. Both of his parents left Louisiana for Minneapolis. His father, I believe both of them, again, same situation, were musicians, singers. They met, married, Prince is born, and Prince, transcendent star. Prince made it clear his whole career that he was Black. He never tried to play any kind of ambiguous, you know what I mean? Like he was Black. He loved his Blackness. He understood the relationship that his Blackness had to his music and to his creativity. And he owed all of that to his Blackness. If we look at people like Elijah Muhammad, right? Responsible for one of the most important Black Power civil rights movements in the history of the United States. If we think about the people that came from this organization, the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, just to name two. We can name others, but just to name two of the most towering Black American icons worldwide. Elijah Muhammad, from rural Georgia, moves to Detroit. Malcolm X, from Nebraska. Muhammad Ali is from Kentucky. The South. He's part of the South. These are part of the Southern states. When we hear music, like the stuff that Aretha Franklin was singing, the stuff that James Brown was singing, the stuff that Shaka Khan, the stuff that Sam Cooke, whoever, you name them, right? They were all speaking specifically about a time of Black power and the need for Black power and Black self-reliance, right? And the same with the Black intellects that, you find in places like New York City with the Harlem Renaissance and all of this. These folks were speaking specifically to a kind of Black power, a need and the necessity for Black power and Black freedom, right? So how did this happen? The Jim Crow segregated schools had everything to do with this. How so, you say? Well, I'm glad you asked. You had educators in the segregated schools who were nurturing Black students and Black children and helping them to understand, not just giving them the academics that they needed, but also the social skills and also the confidence to navigate a society designed against them. And because you have a 100-year school system of this, By the 1960s, you have really the first generation of Black power, right? That took hold, like students who were educated with the Black power mantra. And a lot of it has to do with the work of some folks like Carter G. Woodson and Du Bois, specifically Carter G. Woodson and the miseducation of the Negro around 1930, and his impact on the teaching and the pedagogy and the curriculum that would shape Black schools for the next 30 years leading up to the Civil Rights Movement. If we just look at the music, like for example, you look at Motown, in Detroit, and the musicians that came out of Motown, they all Southerners, they're all from the South. Dig up where Aretha Franklin came from, dig up where Berry Gordy came from, dig up where, Stevie Wonder and, all of these different Motown artists, where they come from. The same with the sounds of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia soul music, like where did they come from? Where'd they come from? They all came from the South. At some point, you see this across the country. It's reflected in the music. It's reflected in our athletes. We all saw the summit, the picture with Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, the best athletes at the time. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was in college, a young boy. And this is the top brass of professional athletes sticking together, coming together for one cause. That's why this is important. It's important for so many reasons. That's it for now. Peace, y'all.